England, early 19th century. The candlelight from 100 chandeliers blazed like captured stars within Hartwell House, the ancestral home of the Duchess of Devonshire. Ladies in silk gowns, fluttering like exotic butterflies, drifted among gentlemen in immaculate evening attire. The orchestra's delicate melody floated through the air, barely audible over the soft hum of aristocratic conversation. Lady Catherine Cobham stood near a pillar, adorned with winter roses, her auburn hair elegantly styled with pearl pins that caught the light with every slight movement of her head. Her emerald gown, though modest by the evening's extravagant standards, complemented the natural grace that had made her one of the most sought-after young ladies of the season. At 22, Catherine had navigated 3 London seasons with the poise expected of the daughter of the Earl of Harrington. She had received numerous proposals, all politely declined, much to her mother's growing consternation. None had stirred her heart, despite the impressive titles and fortunes attached to their names. None except one, perhaps. Across the ballroom stood George Duff, the Duke of Crestwick, his tall figure commanding respect without effort. At 32, he was one of England's most powerful men, a fact reflected in the way the crowd parted as he moved through it. His dark hair and striking features had been the subject of many whispered conversations among debutantes and their watchful mothers. For months now, Catherine had felt the weight of his gaze, following her, at every social gathering. Their conversations, brief exchanges during garden parties or dinner gatherings, had been filled with an undeniable tension, an unspoken attraction that lingered long after they parted. Yet despite their obvious connection, the Duke never stepped beyond the boundaries of polite society. He never requested permission to formally court her, never declared his intentions. He simply watched, as though she were a precious painting he admired from afar, but dared not touch. "Lady Catherine," came a warm, pleasant voice from her left. She turned to find Henry Talbot, the Earl of Whitewood, bowing before her. Unlike the Duke's intense, often inscrutable presence, the Earl's charm was straightforward and refreshing. At 28, he had only recently returned from an extended tour of the continent, bringing with him fascinating tales of art and culture that made him an instant favourite in drawing rooms across London. "Lord Whitewood," she curtsied, offering a genuine smile. "I trust you are enjoying the Duchess's hospitality?" "Immensely," he replied, his blue eyes twinkling with good humour. "Though I find myself in need of a dancing partner for the next set. Would you do me the honour?" Catherine hesitated, her eyes briefly drifting toward the Duke. He stood engaged in conversation with several gentlemen, seemingly oblivious to her presence now. Something inside her hardened with resolve. "I would be delighted, my lord," she said, placing her gloved hand in his. As they took their positions for the quadrille, Catherine couldn't help but notice that the Duke had finally looked up, his dark eyes finding her immediately. Let him watch, she thought, with uncharacteristic defiance. She was tired of waiting for him to make his move in whatever chess game he was playing. The Earl proved to be an excellent dancer and an even better conversationalist. His observations about Italian architecture and French countryside were both intelligent and amusing. When he leaned closer to whisper a particularly witty remark about the French aristocracy's peculiar fashion choices, Catherine laughed, a genuine musical sound that drew the attention of nearby dancers. "You have a lovely laugh, Lady Catherine," Lord Whitewood said softly, "one I hope to hear more often." The sincerity in his voice touched her, and she smiled up at him, a warm, radiant smile that transformed her already beautiful face into something luminous. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Crestwick stopped mid-sentence. The smile that Catherine bestowed upon the Earl was unlike any she had ever directed at him. It was open, unguarded, genuinely delighted. Something dark and possessive unfurled in George's chest at the sight. That smile, the one he had unconsciously been working to earn with each careful, measured interaction, was being freely given to Henry Talbot, a man who had barely been in London a month. Henry Talbot, who was his political rival in Parliament, who opposed his land reform bills, who had been steadily gathering support among the younger lords, and now, it seemed, who was setting his sights on the one woman who had managed to breach the walls around George's carefully guarded heart. Without excusing himself from his companions, the Duke began moving across the ballroom. His eyes never left Catherine, even as the crowd instinctively parted before him. His expression, normally so controlled, betrayed a storm of emotions: determination, possessiveness, and something dangerously close to fear. The music had just ended when he reached them. Without acknowledging the Earl, George extended his hand to Catherine, his voice low and commanding. "Enough, dance with me." It was not a request, it was a declaration. Catherine's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed slightly at his presumption. The Earl beside her stiffened, clearly affronted by the Duke's rudeness. "Your Grace," Lord Whitewood began, his tone carefully controlled. "Lady Catherine and I were just—" "I was not addressing you, Whitewood," the Duke interrupted, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "Lady Catherine—" Catherine found herself at a crossroads. The Duke's sudden display of interest was both thrilling and infuriating. For months he had kept her at arm's length, and now he demanded her attention simply because another man had shown interest. Part of her wanted to refuse him on principle. Yet, as she looked up into his eyes, she saw something she had never witnessed before: vulnerability beneath the commanding exterior. The mighty Duke of Crestwick was afraid of losing something he had never properly claimed. "I believe I promised this dance to Lord Whitewood," she said carefully, watching the muscle in the Duke's jaw tighten. "The next one, then," he insisted, his voice softer, but no less determined. The Earl looked between them, clearly sensing the undercurrents of a history he was not privy to. With remarkable grace he stepped back. "I shall call upon you tomorrow, Lady Catherine," he said with a bow. "Perhaps we might continue our discussion about Venice then." With a pointed look at the Duke, he added, "With your permission, of course, Your Grace," before walking away. As the orchestra struck up a waltz, Catherine placed her hand in the Duke's, keenly aware that every eye in the ballroom was upon them. This dance, this first real waltz between them, would set tongues wagging throughout London by morning. "You are being terribly presumptuous, Your Grace," she said, as he led her into the dance, his hand firm at her waist. "Yes," he agreed simply, surprising her with his candor. "I find that when it comes to you, Lady Catherine, I am capable of behaviors I once thought beneath me." The honesty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. They moved together perfectly, as though they had been dancing partners for years rather than first-time partners. "You watched me for months," she said quietly, meeting his gaze directly. "Why did it take another man's attention to make you act?" The Duke's hold on her tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because I am a fool," he replied, his voice so low it was nearly lost in the music. A cautious, calculating fool who almost realized too late what was truly valuable. As they waltzed across the gleaming floor, the tension that had simmered between them for months began to transform into something else, something that promised either extraordinary happiness or devastating heartbreak. For now, though, Catherine allowed herself to be swept away in the dance, wondering which of the two men, the Duke who had finally awoken or the Earl who had never been asleep, would ultimately win her heart. The following morning, as Catherine sat in her family's breakfast room, her mother could speak of nothing but the Duke's unexpected behavior. "The Duke of Crestwick," Lady Harrington exclaimed for perhaps the 10th time. "Such a prestigious connection. And the way he claimed you on the dance floor, so romantic, so decisive." Catherine stirred her tea absently, or perhaps simply possessive and high-handed. Her father lowered his newspaper, fixing her with a knowing look. "His Grace has been observing you for some time, daughter. I've noticed it at several gatherings." "As has every matchmaking mother and unmarried lady in London," Catherine replied dryly. Yet he made no move to declare himself until Lord Whitewood showed interest. "Men often need a nudge toward what's good for them," her father said with a wink at his wife. "I recall being similarly reluctant to acknowledge my feelings for your mother until Lord Beckford began calling at her family home." Lady Harrington smiled at the memory. "You were terribly slow, my dear." "I was cautious," he corrected with good humor. "As I suspect the Duke is being, men in his position must be wary of fortune hunters and those seeking advancement rather than true connection." Catherine considered this. It was true that George's wealth and title made him a prime target for ambitious families. Perhaps his reserve had been a form of self-protection rather than indifference. Before she could ponder this further, Harrison, their butler, entered with a silver tray bearing several calling cards and 2 elaborate flower arrangements. "From Lord Whitewood, my lady," he announced, placing a modest but exquisite bouquet of white and purple violets before Catherine. "And from His Grace the Duke of Crestwick, The second arrangement was significantly larger, a stunning collection of hothouse roses in deep crimson. Lady Harrington clapped her hands in delight. "Two gentlemen calling in one morning, and such flowers." Catherine reached first for the Earl's card, which bore a simple, handwritten message. "Looking forward to our conversation about Venice. Yours respectfully, Henry Talbot." The Duke's card was equally brief but carried a different weight. "May I call upon you this afternoon, G.D.?" "Well," her father said, amusement playing at the corners of his mouth, "it seems you have decisions to make, Catherine." "Indeed," she murmured, touching one of the crimson roses gently. Each petal was perfect, the bloom expensive and rare for the winter season. It spoke of wealth, of power, and perhaps of a passion kept carefully contained until now. The violets, in contrast, were delicate and sweet, their subtle fragrance reminding her of the Earl's straightforward charm. No grand gestures, just simple, sincere appreciation. Two men, two approaches to courtship. One who had watched from afar for months, and one who had stepped forward immediately. And Catherine caught between them, wondering which path her heart would ultimately choose. The morning after the Duchess of Devonshire's ball, London society buzzed with speculation. In drawing rooms and breakfast parlours across Mayfair, the same scene was described with increasing embellishment. How the formidable Duke of Crestwick had practically stormed across the ballroom to claim Lady Catherine Cobham for a dance, cutting out the charming Earl of Whitewood, in a display that could only be interpreted as passionate intent. Catherine sat in her family's townhouse parlour, pretending to embroider, while her mother read aloud the morning's invitations. In truth, she was replaying the previous night in her mind, particularly the words the Duke had whispered as their dance ended. "I have been remiss in my attentions, Lady Catherine, a situation I intend to rectify immediately." Before she could respond, he had returned her to her mother's side with a formal bow, his face once again composed into its usual mask of aristocratic restraint. Only the intensity in his eyes had hinted at the emotion behind his words. "Lady Catherine," the butler announced from the doorway, interrupting her thoughts, "the Earl of Whitewood has called. He awaits your pleasure in the drawing-room." Her mother set down the letters immediately, her eyes brightening with interest. "Show him in at once, Harrison." Catherine straightened in her seat, smoothing her pale blue morning dress. She had expected Lord Whitewood to call, as he had promised, but not quite so early. His promptness spoke of eagerness, or perhaps strategy. The Earl entered with easy grace, bowing to Lady Harrington before turning his attention to Catherine. In daylight, she noted that his features were even more handsome than she had observed in the ballroom's candlelight, open and expressive, his smile reaching all the way to his eyes. "Lady Harrington, Lady Catherine," he greeted them. "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all, Lord Whitewood," her mother replied warmly. "We are delighted by your visit." After the customary exchange of pleasantries and a brief discussion of the previous evening's entertainment, Lady Harrington excused herself with transparent artifice, leaving Catherine alone with the Earl, though with the door appropriately ajar and a maid seated discreetly in the corner. "I must apologize for my hasty departure last night," Lord Whitewood said once they were relatively private, "though I suspect you found my replacement adequate compensation." His tone was light, but Catherine detected genuine curiosity beneath the humour. "The Duke was unexpectedly assertive," she replied diplomatically. The Earl's smile turned knowing. "Indeed. I wonder what might have prompted such uncharacteristic behaviour from a man famous for his self-control." Catherine felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I couldn't possibly speculate on His Grace's motivations." "Can you not?" Lord Whitewood leaned forward slightly. "Lady Catherine, may I speak plainly?" At her nod, he continued, "I have only recently returned to England, but even on the continent, I heard tales of the Duke of Crestwick's interest in a certain auburn-haired beauty of impeccable lineage and even more impressive intellect. Last night confirmed those rumours." His directness surprised her. Most gentlemen of her acquaintance spoke in layers of polite evasion and subtle implication. "The Duke and I are merely acquaintances, my lord," she said carefully. "Perhaps that is all you have been thus far," he conceded. "But I believe His Grace intends for that to change, as evidenced by his rather dramatic intervention last night." Before Catherine could formulate a response, Harrison reappeared at the door. "His Grace the Duke of Crestwick," he announced. Catherine's heart leapt to her throat as George entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. He wore a perfectly tailored dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat impeccably tied. His expression, when he caught sight of the Earl, hardened momentarily, before smoothing into polite indifference. "Lady Catherine," he bowed, then nodded curtly to Lord Whitewood. "I see I am interrupting. My apologies." "Not at all, Your Grace," Catherine managed, rising to curtsy. "Lord Whitewood and I were just discussing the Duchess's ball. A magnificent affair," the Earl agreed pleasantly, standing to bow to the Duke. "Though I fear I must take my leave. I have an appointment at White's that I cannot miss." He turned to Catherine with genuine warmth. "Lady Catherine, it has been a pleasure. I hope I may call again soon." "You would be most welcome, my lord," she replied, aware of the Duke's eyes tracking their every interaction. Once the Earl had departed, an expectant silence filled the room. The Duke remained standing, his posture rigid as he gazed at her. "You seem to have developed a friendship with Whitewood rather quickly," he observed, his tone deceptively casual. "Lord Whitewood is charming and forthright," Catherine replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Qualities I find refreshing." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, a flash of the same intensity she had glimpsed the previous night. "And do you find me lacking in those qualities, Lady Catherine?" "I find you—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Difficult to read, Your Grace." His expression softened fractionally. "Then allow me to be perfectly clear." He moved closer, still maintaining a proper distance, but near enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I have come to request permission to formally court you." Though she had suspected this might be his purpose, hearing the words spoken aloud sent a flutter through Catherine's chest. For months she had wondered if he would ever declare himself, and now, prompted by Lord Whitewood's attention, he finally had. "Why now?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "Why now, Your Grace?" Catherine repeated, finding courage in her need to understand. "You have had ample opportunity these past months. What has changed?" The Duke hesitated, and for a moment Catherine feared he would retreat behind his usual mask of aristocratic reserve. Instead, he surprised her. "Fear," he admitted, the single word clearly costing him. "I have spent my life making calculated decisions. Marriage, particularly to someone who affects me as you do, was not a matter I approached lightly. I needed time." "And now?" she pressed. "Now I find that caution may cost me something I cannot bear to lose." His gaze was unwavering. "I watched you smile at Whitewood last night, truly smile in a way you never have with me, and I realized that while I was deliberating, someone else might win what I had foolishly believed would wait for my decision." The raw honesty in his voice touched Catherine deeply. This was a side of the Duke she had glimpsed only in fragments during their brief interactions over the months, a man of deep feeling beneath the controlled exterior. "My father will return this afternoon," she said at last. "You may speak with him then." Relief visibly washed over his features. "Thank you, Lady Catherine." "I have not accepted yet, Your Grace," she reminded him, unwilling to surrender too easily after months of uncertainty. A small smile, perhaps the first genuine one she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. "No, you have not, but you will grant me the opportunity to persuade you, which is all I ask for now." As he prepared to take his leave, the Duke paused. "May I inquire if Whitewood has also requested permission to court you?" "He has not," Catherine replied truthfully, "though I suspect he may soon." The Duke nodded, his expression grave once more. "Then I shall return at 4 o'clock to speak with your father." He bowed formally. "Until then, Lady Catherine." After he departed, Catherine sank back into her chair, her mind racing. Within the space of 24 hours, her carefully ordered world had been turned upside down. The Duke of Crestwick, the man who had watched her from afar for so long, was finally declaring his intentions. Yet now there was also Lord Whitewood, whose straightforward manner and genuine warmth presented a compelling alternative. Her mother bustled back into the room, practically vibrating with excitement. "Was that the Duke of Crestwick I saw leaving? And so soon after Lord Whitewood? My dear, you have become the toast of London overnight." Catherine smiled faintly. "The Duke has requested permission to court me. He will return this afternoon to speak with father." Lady Harrington clasped her hands together in delight. "A Duke? Oh, my darling girl, your father will be ecstatic." She paused, studying her daughter's expression. "You do not seem as pleased as I expected. Do you not care for the Duke?" "I hardly know him, Mother," Catherine replied honestly. "He has kept himself at a distance until now." "Well, a courtship will remedy that," her mother said pragmatically. "And what of Lord Whitewood? He is quite handsome, and his estate in Derbyshire is said to be magnificent." "He is kind and interesting," Catherine acknowledged, "but he has not declared any formal intentions." Yet, she added silently to herself, the way Lord Whitewood had looked at her suggested that a declaration might not be far behind. "Well, my dear, it seems you have a decision to make," Lady Harrington said, patting her daughter's hand, "though I must say a dukedom would suit you wonderfully." As her mother launched into plans for adjusting Catherine's wardrobe to befit a future duchess, Catherine gazed out the window at the London street below. Yes, she had a decision to make, perhaps the most important one of her life. The Duke of Crestwick, with his power, position, and the inexplicable pull she had always felt toward him despite his reserve, or Lord Whitewood, whose open admiration and straightforward nature promised a partnership without the mysteries and frustrations the Duke seemed to bring. By the time her father returned home that afternoon, the Duke would be waiting to secure permission to court her. And somehow Catherine knew that Lord Whitewood would not be far behind in making his own intentions clear. The game that had begun with a smile across a ballroom was now fully in play. The Earl of Harrington's study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, filled with the comforting scent of pipe tobacco and old books. It was here that the Duke of Crestwick sat across from Catherine's father, his posture impeccable despite the nerves he concealed beneath his composed exterior. "I must say, Your Grace, your request comes as something of a surprise," Lord Harrington said, studying the younger man thoughtfully. "Though perhaps it shouldn't. My wife has remarked on your attention to Catherine at various functions these past months." "My interest in your daughter is sincere, my lord," George replied. "I would not approach you otherwise." The Earl leaned back in his chair. "Catherine is my only child, Duke. Her happiness is paramount to me above titles, wealth, or advantage." "As it should be," George agreed. "I can offer her all those things, but I hope to offer her happiness as well." Lord Harrington's expression remained measured. "And why should I believe you capable of that? You have a reputation for being somewhat austere. Catherine has a lively spirit." The question cut to the heart of George's own doubts, the very reason he had hesitated so long in declaring himself. Was he, with his reserved nature and the weight of responsibility he had carried since inheriting his title at 23, capable of making the vibrant Lady Catherine truly happy? "I am not a demonstrative man by nature," he admitted. "But your daughter, she awakens something in me that I had thought dormant. I cannot promise I will transform into a different person, but I can promise that I will cherish her, respect her intelligence, and endeavor every day to be worthy of her." The sincerity in his voice must have reached the Earl, for his expression softened slightly. "Very well, Your Grace. You have my permission to court Catherine." He raised a cautioning finger. "But the final decision will be hers alone. I will not pressure her, regardless of the advantages such a match might bring." "I would have it no other way," George assured him, rising to shake the Earl's hand. As the Duke left the study, he nearly collided with Catherine herself, who had evidently been waiting in the hallway. "Lady Catherine," he said, momentarily caught off guard. Her eyes searched his face. "Did my father agree?" "He did," George confirmed, something warm unfurling in his chest at the relief that flashed across her features. "Though he made it quite clear that the final decision rests with you." "As it should," she replied, echoing her father's sentiment. An awkward silence stretched between them, neither quite certain how to proceed now that the formal barriers had been partially removed. "I thought perhaps," George began carefully, "if you are amenable, we might ride tomorrow morning in Hyde Park. The weather is expected to be favourable." Catherine nodded. "I would enjoy that, Your Grace." "George," he said suddenly, "when we are less formal, I would be honoured if you would call me George." The simple request seemed to surprise her, but she smiled. Not the full, radiant smile she had given Lord Whitewood, but a softer, more tentative one that nevertheless made his heart beat faster. "Until tomorrow then, George," she said, testing his name. "Until tomorrow, Catherine," he replied, bowing over her hand before taking his leave. True to his prediction, the following morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect for riding. Catherine, dressed in a fitted forest green riding habit that complemented her auburn hair, waited with her groom in the morning light. When the Duke arrived, punctual to the minute, she was struck again by his imposing figure, particularly atop his magnificent black stallion. They rode side by side through the relative quiet of the park, followed at a discreet distance by her groom. For the first time, conversation between them flowed without the constraints of a crowded ballroom or watchful observers. "You ride exceptionally well," George observed, as Catherine expertly guided her mare around a bend in the path. "My father insisted I learn properly, not merely to perch decoratively upon a docile mount," she replied with a small smile. "He was determined I should be capable in all things." "He has succeeded admirably," George said. "Your reputation for intelligence and competence precedes you everywhere." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Is that why you watched me for so long without approaching? Were you evaluating my qualifications?" The directness of her question might have offended another man of his station, but George found her frankness refreshing after years of navigating the carefully crafted words of society and politics. "No," he admitted. "I was gathering courage." "Courage?" she repeated incredulously. "You, the Duke of Crestwick, who faces down opponents in Parliament without flinching, required courage to speak to me." George slowed his horse, turning to face her fully. "Yes," he said simply. "You unsettle me, Catherine. From the first moment I saw you, not just your beauty, but the way you carried yourself, the intelligence in your eyes, the kindness you showed to that elderly dowager when everyone else had abandoned her to seek more entertaining company. You were different. And it terrified me." The confession hung between them in the morning air. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "How could you?" he responded. "I made certain of it. Control has been my watchword since inheriting my responsibilities at a young age. You threatened that control in ways I could not immediately reconcile." As they continued their ride, Catherine began to see the Duke, George, in a new light. The reserve she had interpreted as arrogance or indifference was, perhaps, a shield he had constructed to protect himself in a world where vulnerability was seen as weakness. Their morning rides became a daily ritual over the next fortnight. With each passing day, Catherine discovered more layers to the complex man beneath the ducal title. His dry wit, which emerged when he was truly comfortable. His passionate commitment to improving conditions for tenant farmers on his extensive estates. His unexpectedly gentle way with children, revealed when they encountered a lost little boy in the park, whom George had helped return to his frantic nurse. Yet, just as she was beginning to believe she understood him, a footman delivered a note from Lord Whitewood, reminding her that her choice was not yet made. "My dearest Lady Catherine," the note read, "I have been granted the honour of a private box at the theatre this evening for a new production of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Would you and your parents do me the honour of joining me? I have always found that Beatrice and Benedict's spirited exchanges remind me of our own conversations. Yours with great admiration, Henry Talbot." Catherine smiled at the comparison. There was indeed something of Benedict's wit and charm in the Earl's manner. She accepted the invitation, curious to see how an evening in Henry's company might compare to her mornings with George. The theatre was crowded with London's elite, all eager to see the famed actress Mrs. Siddons in her return to the stage. The Earl's box was perfectly situated, and his attentiveness throughout the evening was impeccable. He shared amusing observations about the audience, as well as thoughtful comments on the performance, making Catherine laugh more than once with his clever asides. "You seem happier tonight than when we last met," Henry observed during the interval, as her parents conversed with acquaintances in the next box. "Has something changed?" Catherine considered how to respond. "I have had time to reflect on recent events," she said carefully. "Ah?" His smile was knowing. "And has the Duke of Crestwick featured prominently in these reflections?" "You are very direct, Lord Whitewood." "Henry," he corrected gently. "And yes, I believe in speaking plainly. Life is too short for ambiguity, especially in matters of the heart." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I should like to request permission to court you formally, Lady Catherine. I believe we would suit admirably." Though she had anticipated this, the timing still took her by surprise. "I must inform you that the Duke has already received my father's permission to court me," she said honestly. Henry's expression remained undaunted. "I suspected as much. Does that mean I should withdraw my interest?" It would be the conventional choice, Catherine admitted, but not necessarily the right one, he countered. Unless, of course, your heart is already decided. The question hung between them, direct and unapologetic in its presumption. Was her heart decided? The morning rides with George had revealed a depth to the Duke she had only guessed at before. Yet here was Henry, offering a path unmarked by the complexities that seemed to accompany every interaction with George. "My heart is considering its options," she replied at last. Henry's smile was genuine. "Then I shall speak with your father tomorrow, and perhaps if he consents you might consider joining me for a drive in the park the day after. The weather should be fair." "You are very confident, Lord Whitewood," Catherine observed. "Henry," he reminded her again. "And not confident, hopeful. There is a difference." As they returned to their seats for the final act, Catherine felt the weight of his words. Two men now vied openly for her attention, each offering a different future, a different kind of partnership. The Duke with his powerful intensity and carefully revealed depths, the Earl with his open warmth and straightforward charm. The choice would not be easy. But for the first time, Catherine found herself grateful for the circumstances that had brought her to this crossroads. Whatever path she chose, she would do so with eyes wide open, having glimpsed the true nature of both men beyond the masks they presented to society. The curtain rose on the final act, and Catherine settled back to watch the resolution of Beatrice and Benedict's story, wondering if her own tale would find as satisfying a conclusion. The following week brought a flurry of activity as both the Duke and the Earl pursued their courtship of Catherine with increasing fervour. London society watched with avid interest as the two men, so different in temperament and approach, competed for the hand of Lady Catherine Cobham. Mornings still belonged to George, their rides in Hyde Park becoming a fixture of Catherine's routine. Each day, she discovered more about the man behind the ducal title. His childhood at Crestwick Manor, the heavy responsibility thrust upon him when his father died unexpectedly, his meticulous stewardship of his vast estates. Little by little, the austere Duke was allowing her glimpses of the man beneath the title. Afternoons often brought Henry to her door, sometimes for a stroll through the garden, other times for a carriage ride through fashionable streets. Where George was methodical and thoughtful, Henry was spontaneous and expressive. He brought tales of his European travels, books of poetry he thought she might enjoy, and a warmth that required no careful interpretation. Catherine found herself genuinely torn. With George, she felt a profound connection that deepened with each shared confidence. The rare smile that transformed his serious countenance became increasingly frequent in her presence, and she found herself working to elicit it, treasuring each hard-won glimpse of his inner self. With Henry, laughter came easily. His open admiration and straightforward manner were like sunshine after years of navigating the carefully controlled waters of aristocratic society. There was no puzzle to solve with the Earl. What she saw was precisely what she received. "You seem distracted today," George observed during one of their morning rides. "Have I said something to displease you?" Catherine shook her head. "Not at all. I was merely thinking." "About Whitewood?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Yes, in part. He called yesterday afternoon." Something flickered in George's eyes, a flash of the same possessiveness she had witnessed the night of the Duchess's ball. "I see." They rode in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "May I ask what you discussed?" "Italian poetry," Catherine replied, "and his travels through the Veneto region." "Ah." George's expression remained carefully composed. "I have never been to Italy myself. Too many responsibilities have kept me in England." The subtle contrast was not lost on Catherine. The Duke's life was one of duty and obligation. The Earl's had been one of freedom and exploration. Each offered a different future, one rooted in tradition and responsibility, the other promising new horizons and experiences. "Perhaps you might travel there someday," she suggested. He looked at her then, something vulnerable in his gaze. "I had thought perhaps we might travel there together, if you were to choose me." The simple admission, so tentative from a man accustomed to certainty in all things, touched Catherine deeply. This was the George few others ever saw, the man beneath the ducal armour, capable of hope and uncertainty like any other. "That would be lovely," she said softly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Then I shall add it to my list of persuasions. That afternoon, as if sensing a shift in the wind, Henry arrived with an invitation to a musical evening at his townhouse. A small gathering, he assured her parents. Just a few friends who share an appreciation for fine music. The pianist is a prodigy I discovered in Vienna, only 16 but already composing works of astonishing beauty. Lady Harrington, who had been increasingly torn between the prestige of a ducal connection and the undeniable charm of the Earl, immediately accepted on the family's behalf. "How wonderful!" she exclaimed. "Catherine has always loved music. She plays the pianoforte quite beautifully herself, though she would never admit it." Henry's eyes lit up at this revelation. "Then perhaps Lady Catherine might be persuaded to play for us. I should be honoured." Catherine demurred, but the Earl's gentle insistence throughout the evening eventually won her over. After the young Viennese prodigy had dazzled the small audience with his virtuosity, Catherine took her place at the instrument, selecting a simple but emotionally resonant piece by Mozart. As she played, she was keenly aware of Henry watching her, his expression one of genuine admiration. When she finished, his applause was the most enthusiastic of all. "You play with such feeling," he said as she rejoined the gathering. "Music reveals the heart, I think, in ways words often cannot." "You are too kind," Catherine replied. "After the young maestro's performance, mine was quite unremarkable." "On the contrary," Henry countered, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. "His playing showed technical brilliance. Yours showed soul." The compliment, delivered with such sincere conviction, warmed Catherine. Henry had a gift for making her feel truly seen, not as the daughter of an earl or a potential duchess, but simply as herself. The musical evening was followed 2 days later by an invitation from George to visit his country estate at Crestwick Manor. The invitation included her parents, of course, to maintain propriety, but the significance was clear. George was inviting Catherine to see his ancestral home, the heart of his dukedom, and the place he held most dear. The journey to Hertfordshire took most of a day, but Catherine found herself increasingly eager as they approached. Crestwick Manor had a reputation for being one of England's most impressive estates, and as the carriage rounded a bend in the drive, revealing the house itself, Catherine understood why. The manor was magnificent, a sprawling Tudor edifice with later classical additions, its honey-coloured stone glowing warmly in the afternoon light. Gardens stretched in every direction, impeccably maintained despite the early spring season. George awaited them on the steps, a more relaxed version of himself in country attire, his customary formality softened by the rural setting. "Welcome to Crestwick," he said simply, but Catherine could see the pride and love he held for his home in every line of his body. The weekend unfolded as a revelation. Here, away from London's watchful eyes, George seemed to shed layers of reserve with each passing hour. He personally guided Catherine through the estate, from the ancient oak woodlands to the meticulously planned kitchen gardens. He showed her the improvements he had made to tenant cottages and the new schoolhouse built to educate all children on the estate, regardless of station. "My father believed education should be available to all," he explained as they walked the grounds. "It was one of the few things we agreed upon. The rest—" He hesitated. "The rest I have had to discover for myself." "You've done remarkable work here," Catherine said, genuinely impressed by what she had seen. "Your tenants seem truly content." "They are my responsibility," he replied simply. "Their welfare is bound to mine." In those few words, Catherine glimpsed the core of George Duff, a man who took his duties seriously, who understood the weight of privilege and the obligations it carried. It was a different kind of appeal than Henry's charming spontaneity, but no less powerful in its own way. On their final evening at Crestwick, George invited Catherine to join him in the library after her parents had retired. The room was a testament to generations of scholarly Duffs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace, a massive oak desk positioned before windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. "This is my favourite room in the house," George admitted as he poured her a small glass of sherry. "More than the grand ballroom or the state dining room. Here, I feel most myself." Catherine could see why. The space was both impressive and intimate, much like the Duke himself. "It suits you," she said softly. He handed her the glass, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I wanted you to see Crestwick," he said after a moment, "not just as a potential residence, but as the place that has shaped me. For better or worse, this estate, its history, its people, has made me the man I am." "And who is that man, George?" Catherine asked, sensing they had reached a crucial point in their understanding of each other. "Beyond the title, beyond the duties and responsibilities." He set his glass down, moving to stand by the fire, its light casting his strong profile into sharp relief. "A man who has spent his life trying to be worthy of his position, who has made sacrifices for duty that others might find incomprehensible." He turned to face her fully. "A man who until recently believed that personal happiness might be one such sacrifice." "And now?" Catherine prompted gently. "Now I find myself unwilling to make that particular sacrifice." His dark eyes held hers intently. "Because of you, Catherine. You have made me question assumptions I have held my entire adult life, chief among them the belief that duty and personal joy must necessarily be separate paths." The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. This was not the practiced gallantry of a society courtship, but the genuine confession of a man who had spent his life holding others at a careful distance. "I cannot promise to be demonstrative in the manner of Whitewood," he continued. "My nature is what it is, but I can promise that what I feel for you is genuine, and that I would endeavor every day to be worthy of your choice, should you make it in my favor." Catherine set her own glass aside, crossing the room to stand before him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your honesty, for showing me Crestwick, for allowing me to see the man behind the Duke." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Instead, with visible restraint, he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the gesture both proper and somehow more intimate than any conventional kiss might have been. "We should rejoin your parents," he said, his voice slightly roughened, "before propriety is too thoroughly compromised." As they left the library, Catherine found herself more confused than ever. The weekend at Crestwick had revealed depths to George she had only guessed at before, a passion for his responsibilities, a profound understanding of duty balanced with compassion, and a capacity for feeling that he kept carefully contained beneath his controlled exterior. Yet when they returned to London, Henry Talbot awaited with his own brand of courtship. Tickets to an art exhibition, an introduction to a visiting American dignitary with fascinating perspectives on the New Republic, a private tour of the Tower of London arranged through his connections. Where George offered substance and depth, Henry provided stimulation and novelty. Both men were worthy, both clearly cared for her deeply, and both represented futures that held genuine appeal, if in vastly different ways. The situation came to a head at the midsummer ball hosted by the Earl of Westhaven. Both George and Henry were in attendance, both equally determined to claim Catherine's attention. She had danced with each of them once, fulfilling propriety while maintaining a careful balance between her suitors. Now she stood on the terrace, seeking a moment's respite from the heat of the ballroom and the weight of so many speculative glances. "A penny for your thoughts," came George's voice from behind her. Catherine turned to find him watching her, his expression softer than it had been earlier in the evening when he had observed her dancing with Henry. "They are worth considerably more than that, I assure you," she replied with a small smile. He moved to stand beside her at the stone balustrade, maintaining a proper distance yet close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I saw you dancing with Whitewood," he said carefully. "You seemed happy." "Henry is an entertaining partner," she acknowledged. "Henry," George repeated, the muscle in his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "You are on familiar terms, then?" Catherine faced him directly. "As I am with you, George. Both of you are courting me, after all." "Yes," he agreed, his voice low and controlled, "though I find I dislike sharing your attention more than I anticipated." The admission surprised her. "You cannot have expected me to refuse Lord Whitewood's suit simply because you had already declared yours." "No," he conceded. "That would have been presumptuous." "It would have been," she agreed. Then, more gently, "But I understand the sentiment. I do not think I would like to see you courting another woman either." Something flared in his eyes at her words, hope perhaps, or determination. "Catherine," he began, then stopped himself, seeming to wrestle with what he wanted to say. "I am not skilled at expressing sentiment. It does not come naturally to me as it seems to for Whitewood." He took a deep breath. "But my feelings for you are no less profound for being carefully guarded." She studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the struggle written in the tense lines around his mouth, the vulnerability in eyes that usually revealed nothing. "I don't need flowery declarations or grand gestures, George," she said softly. "But I do need to know that if I were to choose you, I would be choosing a partner who would share himself with me, his thoughts, his worries, his joys, not just a protector or provider." Before he could respond, the terrace doors opened and Henry Talbot stepped out, his expression darkening slightly when he spotted them together. "Forgive the interruption," he said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely sorry. "Lady Catherine, they are forming sets for the waltz. I believe you promised this dance to me." George stiffened beside her, but said nothing, leaving the choice to her, as he had promised her father he would. "A moment, please, Lord Whitewood," Catherine said. "The Duke and I were in the middle of a conversation." Henry bowed slightly. "Of course, I shall await you inside." Once they were alone again, Catherine turned back to George. "You were saying?" The Duke seemed to come to some internal decision. With deliberate care he took her hand in his touch warm even through her glove. "I was saying," he continued, his voice steadier now, "that I love you, Catherine Cobham. I have loved you since you challenged Lord Belford's assessment of the poor laws at Lady Russell's dinner party last autumn, and every day since. I cannot promise to transform into a different man overnight, but I can promise that with you, I will try to be the man you deserve, one who shares not just his name and fortune but his heart as well." The simple declaration, delivered without flourish but with unmistakable sincerity, moved Catherine more deeply than any elaborate protestation could have. This was George, straightforward, honourable, and now, finally, open. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your honesty." He nodded, releasing her hand reluctantly. "You should not keep Whitewood waiting. It would be impolite." As Catherine returned to the ballroom, her mind was in turmoil. George's declaration had stripped away her last serious reservation about him. Yet Henry, too, had shown her nothing but genuine affection and respect throughout their acquaintance. She took her place across from the Earl for the waltz, acutely aware of George watching from the edge of the ballroom, his expression once again carefully composed. "You seem distracted this evening," Henry observed as they moved through the steps of the dance. "I have much to consider," she replied honestly. Henry's blue eyes studied her face. "The Duke has made his declaration, hasn't he?" Surprised by his perception, Catherine nodded slightly. "I suspected he might. The way he looks at you." Henry sighed. "I had hoped to have more time to show you what life could be like with someone whose heart is not quite so heavily guarded. You have been nothing but forthright from the beginning," Catherine acknowledged. "It is a quality I greatly admire." "But is admiration enough?" he asked quietly. "Catherine, I too must be forthright now. I care for you deeply, more than I anticipated when I first returned to England. Your intelligence, your compassion, your quiet strength, they have captivated me completely." As the music swelled around them, Catherine felt the weight of the choice before her. Two good men, each offering a different kind of future, a different kind of love. "I need time," she said finally. "This decision cannot be made lightly." "Of course," Henry agreed, though disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes. "Just know that whatever you decide, I wish for your happiness above all else, even if that happiness is not found with me." The generosity of his response only made her decision more difficult. As the evening drew to a close, Catherine found herself at another crossroads. Both George and Henry had requested the honour of escorting her and her parents home in their respective carriages. In the end, propriety dictated that she leave with her family in their own conveyance, granting neither suitor an advantage. As their carriage pulled away from the West Haven mansion, Catherine caught a glimpse of both men standing on the steps, the tall, commanding Duke and the charming, expressive Earl, each watching her departure with hopeful expectation. "Well, my dear," her father said as they settled into the journey home, "it seems you have a decision to make." "Yes," Catherine agreed, her heart heavy with the responsibility. "I do." For 3 days following the West Haven ball, Catherine sequestered herself at home, declining all callers and invitations. Both the Duke and the Earl sent notes and flowers, but she returned polite, non-committal responses to both, requesting time to consider her choice. On the morning of the 4th day, she rose early and asked for her horse to be saddled. Without her usual groom or companion, just a single footman following at a discreet distance for propriety's sake, she rode to Hyde Park, seeking the clarity that had eluded her in the confines of her home. The park was nearly empty at this hour, mist still clinging to the grass as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the ancient oaks. Catherine guided her mare along familiar paths, her mind circling endlessly around the choice that lay before her. George Duff, Duke of Crestwick, a man of depth and principle, whose reserve masked a passionate nature he revealed only to those he trusted completely. A man who had watched her from afar, gathering courage to approach her, and who had finally declared himself with a straightforward honesty that spoke more eloquently than any poetic declaration. Henry Talbot, Earl of Whitewood, charming, forthright, and unafraid to show his feelings openly. A man who had stepped forward immediately, who offered a partnership free from the complications that seemed woven into every interaction with the Duke, both worthy, both honourable, both clearly in love with her. As she rounded a bend in the path, Catherine was startled to find George himself mounted on his black stallion, equally surprised to encounter her. "Lady Catherine," he said, recovering quickly, "I did not expect to see you here this morning." "Nor I you," she replied. "I thought you had business in Parliament today. I postponed it." His gaze was steady. "My mind has been otherwise occupied." The simple admission touched her. For a man like George, with his deep sense of duty, to set aside official responsibilities spoke volumes about his state of mind. They fell into step together, their horses walking side by side along the misty path. For several minutes neither spoke, the silence between them surprisingly comfortable despite the unresolved nature of their relationship. "I have been thinking," Catherine said at last, "about what you said at the West Haven ball." George nodded, but did not interrupt, giving her space to collect her thoughts. "You said you could not promise to transform overnight, but that you would try to be the man I deserve." She looked at him directly. "I realize that I have been unfair in my assessment of you." His brow furrowed slightly. "How so?" "I have been comparing your reserve to Lord Whitewood's openness, as though one were inherently superior to the other. But that is not true, is it? They are simply different approaches to the world, each with its own value, each with its own costs." George considered this. "A generous interpretation." "Not generous," Catherine corrected gently. "Just the qualities that make you who you are, your sense of duty, your careful consideration before action, your unwillingness to speak unless you have something meaningful to say. These are not flaws to be overcome. They are the foundation of your character." Something like hope flickered in his dark eyes, quickly contained. "And Whitewood's character? How do you assess that?" Catherine smiled faintly. "Equally worthy, though different. His openness, his enthusiasm for experience, his willingness to declare himself without reservation, these too are admirable traits." "Then your choice remains difficult," George observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes and no," Catherine replied, "for I have realized something else as well." She drew her horse to a halt, turning to face him fully. "When I imagine my future, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges that lie ahead, there is only one man I can envision sharing that journey with me." George's composure slipped, naked hope visible in his expression for a brief, unguarded moment. "And that man is?" "You, George." The words once spoken felt absolutely right. "It has always been you." For a moment he seemed frozen, as though afraid to believe what he was hearing. Then, with uncharacteristic impulsiveness, he dismounted and moved to help her down from her horse. As her feet touched the ground, his hands remained at her waist, their faces now mere inches apart. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Whitewood could give you a life with fewer complications, fewer responsibilities." "I don't want fewer complications," Catherine replied softly. "I want you, with all your complexity, all your depth. The man who values substance over display, who considers carefully before speaking, but whose every word carries weight because of it." Something in George's expression broke open then, the final barrier between the Duke and the man falling away completely. With exquisite gentleness he cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepening as Catherine responded. All the tension that had simmered between them for months found release in this moment of connection. proper enough for a public park at dawn, yet intimate enough to seal the promise between them. When they finally parted, George rested his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady. "I love you, Catherine Cobham," he whispered, "more than I thought it possible to love another person." "And I love you, George Duff," she replied, her heart full to bursting. "Not for your dukedom or your estates, but for the man you have allowed me to see beneath the title." Later that day, Catherine sat in her father's study, her decision made, but one task still before her. Henry deserved to hear her choice directly, not through gossip or formal announcement. When he was shown in, his expression brightened at the sight of her, then dimmed as he read something in her face. "You've made your decision," he said simply. Catherine nodded. "I have. And I owe you the courtesy of hearing it from me personally." Henry's smile was sad but genuine. "It's Crestwick, isn't it?" "Yes," she confirmed gently, though the choice was far from easy. He sighed, running a hand through his fair hair. "I suspected as much when I saw you riding with him this morning." At her surprised look, he added, "I too sometimes seek clarity in the park at dawn. I saw you from a distance, but did not approach. The way you looked at him told me everything I needed to know." Catherine felt a rush of admiration for his grace in defeat. "You are a good man, Henry Talbot. Any woman would be fortunate to win your heart." "Perhaps," he agreed with a sad smile, "though it may take some time before I am prepared to offer it again." He bowed formally. "I shall take my leave now. Please convey my respects to your parents." As Henry departed, Catherine felt a momentary pang of regret, not for her choice, which she knew with absolute certainty was the right one, but for the pain it necessarily caused a man who deserved only happiness. Yet such was the nature of choices. Each path taken meant others left unexplored. Each yes implied 1,000 no's. In choosing George, she had chosen a life of deeper complexity, greater responsibility, and profound connection with a man whose reserve masked depths few were privileged to glimpse. It was the right choice, her choice, and Catherine faced the future with the same clear-eyed determination that had first caught the Duke's attention across a crowded ballroom so many months ago. Dawn broke over London with gentle persistence, painting the sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold. Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching as the city gradually came to life below. Today would bring the formal announcement of her engagement to the Duke of Crestwick, setting in motion the preparations for a wedding that would be the talk of London society. Yet Catherine's thoughts were not on guest lists or trousseau details. Instead, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from those months of silent observation to the night when a smile given to another man had finally spurred George to action. A soft knock at her door preceded her mother's entrance. "Already awake?" Lady Harrington asked, noticing her daughter fully dressed. "I expected to find you still abed after the excitement of yesterday." Yesterday had seen George formally request Catherine's hand in marriage from her father, a formality given Lord Harrington's previous permission for the courtship, but one the Duke insisted upon observing properly. The family celebration afterward had lasted well into the evening, with champagne and toasts, and her mother's barely contained delight at the prospect of her daughter becoming a duchess. "I couldn't sleep," Catherine admitted. "There's too much to think about." Lady Harrington crossed to stand beside her at the window. "Second thoughts?" "No," Catherine replied immediately. "Not about George. Never about George." "But," her mother prompted gently. Catherine sighed. "But I keep thinking about Lord Whitewood, about how gracious he was when I told him of my decision. I can't help feeling that he deserved better than to have his hopes raised only to be disappointed." "Ah," Lady Harrington nodded, understanding. "You have a kind heart, my dear. But remember that Lord Whitewood entered the competition for your hand with full awareness that the Duke had already declared himself. He chose to take that risk." "I know," Catherine acknowledged. "Still, I wish there had been a way to spare him pain." "In matters of the heart, pain is sometimes unavoidable," her mother said wisely. "But time heals such wounds. Lord Whitewood will find happiness elsewhere, I have no doubt." As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself caught up in a whirlwind of activity. The announcement would appear in tomorrow's papers, but already messengers had been dispatched to inform close family and friends. By noon, the house was filled with flowers and congratulatory notes. By afternoon, Lady Harrington had summoned the family solicitor to discuss settlements and the modiste to begin planning Catherine's wedding clothes. Through it all, Catherine maintained her composure, answering questions and making decisions with the quiet confidence that had always been her hallmark. But beneath the surface, she found herself longing for a moment's peace, a chance to center herself amidst the sudden flurry of attention. As if sensing her need, a note arrived from George in the late afternoon. "Might I persuade you to join me for a walk in the garden at sunset? There is something I wish to discuss with you privately." "Yours, G." Catherine secured her mother's permission easily enough, with the provision that her lady's maid would accompany them at a discreet distance. By the time George arrived, the sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden glow over the Harringtons' modest but well-tended London garden. He was waiting for her on the gravel path, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. When he turned at the sound of her approach, the warmth in his eyes made Catherine's heart skip a beat. This was still new, this openness between them, this freedom to show affection without the constraints of uncertainty. "You look beautiful," he said simply, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you." Catherine smiled up at him. "Your note mentioned something you wished to discuss." George nodded, offering her his arm as they began to walk the winding paths between neatly trimmed hedges and late-blooming roses. "I received word this morning that Whitewood has left London." The news caught Catherine by surprise. "Left? Where has he gone?" "Back to the continent, according to my sources. He departed at first light, leaving instructions with his steward to manage his affairs indefinitely." Catherine felt a pang of guilt. "Because of me?" "Perhaps in part," George acknowledged, "though I suspect he had been considering a return to his travels for some time. London society can be stifling for those accustomed to wider horizons." They walked in silence for a moment, Catherine absorbing this unexpected development. "I hope he finds happiness," she said at last. "As do I," George replied, surprising her with his sincerity. "Despite our rivalry, I have always respected Whitewood. He is a man of principle, if somewhat impulsive in his approach." Catherine glanced up at him, noting the faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're becoming quite generous in your assessment of your former rival, Your Grace." "It's easier to be magnanimous in victory," George admitted with uncharacteristic humor. "Besides, he helped me realize what I might have lost through excessive caution. For that alone, I owe him a debt of gratitude." The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows across the garden and painting the clouds in brilliant hues of orange and purple. As they rounded a bend in the path, George drew Catherine to a stone bench partially hidden by a trellis covered in late-blooming clematis. "There was something else I wanted to discuss with you," he said as they sat, his expression growing more serious. "Something about our future together." Catherine nodded encouragingly. "I'm listening." "I know that becoming a duchess carries certain expectations," he began carefully. "Society will have definite ideas about your role, your conduct, your every decision." "I'm well aware," Catherine assured him, having spent her life navigating the complex social rules of the aristocracy. "What you may not be aware of is that I have little regard for society's expectations when they conflict with what I believe to be right." The intensity in his gaze held her captive. "My mother was constrained by my father's rigid adherence to tradition. It made her deeply unhappy, though she never complained. I vowed long ago that I would not repeat his mistakes." Catherine's heart swelled at this glimpse into his thinking. "What are you saying, George?" "I'm saying that as my Duchess you will have freedom that few women of your rank enjoy. Freedom to pursue your intellectual interests, to voice your opinions, to contribute to the management of our estates in whatever capacity you wish." His expression was earnest. "I do not want a decorative consort, Catherine. I want a true partner, one who challenges me, counsels me, stands beside me in all things." The declaration, so at odds with conventional aristocratic marriages, moved Catherine deeply. Here was yet another layer to the complex man she had chosen, a progressive thinker beneath the traditional exterior. "That is a rare and precious gift," she said softly. "Not a gift," he corrected. "A recognition of your capabilities. You have one of the finest minds I've ever encountered, regardless of gender. It would be not just a personal loss, but a disservice to our estates and dependents, if that mind were confined to planning dinner parties and choosing draperies." Catherine couldn't help but laugh. "Though I expect I shall have to do those things as well." "Indeed," he agreed with a smile, "but they need not be your primary occupation." As the light faded around them, Catherine found herself filled with a profound sense of rightness. This was what had drawn her to George from the beginning, not just the magnetic pull between them, but the recognition of a kindred spirit beneath his reserved exterior, a person of substance, of principle, of depth. "There is one more thing," George said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box, the sort that typically held a ring. "I know we shall have a formal exchange of gifts before the wedding, but I wanted to give you this privately." Catherine accepted the box with fingers that trembled slightly. Opening it, she found not a ring but a delicate key of clearly antique design. "What is this?" she asked, puzzled. "The key to my mother's private study at Crestwick," George explained. "It has remained locked since her death 15 years ago. I thought you might like to make it your own. A space entirely yours within the house, where you can read, write, think without interruption." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Catherine more deeply than any conventional jewel could have. Here was tangible proof of George's commitment to her independence, to supporting the woman she was, rather than molding her into a conventional duchess. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her hand around the key. "I shall treasure it." George reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "I want you to be happy at Crestwick, Catherine. Happy with me. I cannot promise there won't be challenges. My position carries responsibilities that cannot always be set aside, but I can promise that within those constraints, I will always seek to put your happiness alongside duty, not beneath it." In that moment, any lingering doubts Catherine might have harbored about her choice vanished completely. She had chosen not just with her heart, but with her mind, a partner who valued all aspects of her being, who sought to elevate rather than diminish her. "I love you, George Duff," she said simply, holding his gaze, "and I cannot wait to begin our life together." His smile, the rare, genuine smile that transformed his serious features into something approaching boyish charm, was answer enough. But his words, when they came, sealed the promise between them. "Nor I, Catherine Cobham, nor I." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Catherine stood before the ancient Norman church on the Crestwick estate. Her wedding day finally arrived. The ceremony itself would be an affair of understated elegance that reflected both the Duke's reserved nature and Catherine's preference for meaning over display. As she prepared to walk down the aisle toward George, she recalled the journey that had brought them to this moment. From silent observation to reluctant declaration, from uncertainty to unwavering commitment. The man who waited for her at the altar was still the same powerful Duke who had watched her from across countless ballrooms, but he was also more, a man who had learned to lower his defenses, to risk vulnerability for the sake of love. When they spoke their vows, George's voice rang out clear and steady, heard by every guest in attendance, a public declaration from a man once known for his privacy. Catherine's response was equally firm, a promise made with full awareness of both the challenges and the joys that lay ahead. Their life together began as it would continue, with respect, honesty, and a deepening understanding that the most worthwhile connections often require the greatest courage to forge. 2 years later, the Duke and Duchess of Crestwick welcomed their first child, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined spirit. She was followed in time by twin sons, who would grow to combine their father's sense of duty with their mother's compassionate intelligence. As for Henry Talbot, Earl of Whitewood, his travels eventually led him to Vienna, where he met and fell in love with Lady Sophia Russell, the unconventional daughter of the British ambassador. Her forthright manner and quick wit matched his own, and when they returned to England 3 years after Henry's departure, even Catherine could see that his prior heartbreak had led him to a happiness he might otherwise never have found. At social gatherings where both couples were present, there was no awkwardness, only the mutual respect of people who had once stood at a crossroads and found their proper paths. And sometimes at balls much like the one where their story began, attendees would observe the Duke of Crestwick watching his Duchess from across the room, not with the cautious assessment of years past, but with open adoration that needed no interpretation. For some journeys, the first step is not a stride forward, but the courage to cross a crowded ballroom and declare, "Enough, dance with me." And sometimes, the wisest heart is the one that recognizes this truth, that the love worth having is not always the one that comes easily, but the one that challenges us to become more fully ourselves. 5 years later, the grand ballroom of Crestwick Manor glittered with candlelight, the ancestral home of the Duff family transformed for the annual harvest celebration. Local gentry mingled with tenant farmers and villagers in a tradition the current Duke had instituted shortly after his marriage, much to the initial consternation of some of his more traditional peers. Duchess Catherine Crestwick stood near the refreshment table, smiling as she watched her husband kneel to speak eye to eye with a farmer's young daughter who had presented him with a somewhat crushed bouquet of wildflowers. The mighty Duke of Crestwick, once known throughout London for his formidable reserve, now accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, tucking one bloom into his waistcoat before returning the rest to the delighted child. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice from behind her. "Still finding ways to scandalize society, I see. Tenant farmers in the ducal ballroom. Whatever next?" Catherine turned with a warm smile to greet Henry Talbot, Earl of Whitewood, and his wife, Lady Sophia. "Henry, Sophia, how wonderful to see you both. And yes, I believe keeping society mildly scandalized is good for their constitution." Sophia laughed, her hand resting comfortably on her slightly rounded belly that suggested the Whitewoods would soon welcome a second child to join their 2-year-old son. "I couldn't agree more. Keeps the blood circulating in all those calcified aristocratic veins." The years had been kind to all of them. Henry had lost none of his charm, though it was now tempered with a deeper maturity. His marriage to Sophia, a match that had surprised many with its swiftness, had proven remarkably successful, their similar temperaments and shared interests creating a partnership of equals. "Where are your little ones this evening?" Sophia inquired. "I was hoping to see how much they've grown." "Already abed, I'm afraid," Catherine replied, though not before extracting a promise from their father to come and tell them all about the ball in the morning. The sound of familiar footsteps approached, and George joined their circle, his eyes warming as they met Catherine's. "Whitewood, Lady Sophia," he greeted them with genuine pleasure. "I'm glad you could make the journey. How are things in Parliament?" As the men fell into discussion of recent political developments, Catherine and Sophia exchanged knowing glances. The rivalry that had once existed between their husbands had transformed over time into a productive political alliance, and eventually a friendship that both women suspected neither man had anticipated. "He still looks at you as though you hung the moon," Sophia observed quietly, nodding toward George, whose gaze regularly returned to Catherine even as he spoke with Henry. Catherine smiled. "As yours does you. We are fortunate women." "Indeed," Sophia agreed, "though I still remember Henry's melancholy when he first returned from London after your engagement was announced. It took me months to convince him I wasn't merely a consolation prize." "And now?" Catherine asked. "Now he thanks Providence daily that his heart was free when we met," Sophia replied with satisfaction. "As do I." The orchestra struck up a waltz, and George excused himself from Henry mid-sentence to turn to Catherine. "Duchess," he said formally, though his eyes danced with private meaning, "would you do me the honor?" Catherine placed her hand in his, feeling the same thrill she had experienced that first night when he had crossed the ballroom to claim her. "Always, Your Grace." As they moved onto the floor, George pulled her slightly closer than strict propriety dictated. "Do you remember the first time we danced?" he murmured. "How could I forget?" she replied. "You practically ordered me to join you." "I was desperate," he admitted with a small smile. "Watching you smile at Whitewood like that, I thought I'd lost you before I'd even properly tried to win you." Catherine's eyes softened. "You hadn't lost me. In fact, that might have been the moment I truly began to find you, the man beneath the ducal crown." They moved together in perfect harmony, years of partnership evident in the easy synchronization of their steps. Around them, other couples gave them space, some watching with undisguised admiration the obvious affection between the Duke and his Duchess. 5 years, George mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you agreed to become my wife. Other times, I can barely remember what my life was like before you and the children." "Empty drawing rooms and excessively tidy nurseries," Catherine teased gently. Precisely, he agreed. A well-ordered existence entirely devoid of scattered toys, bedtime stories, and a wife who challenges my every assumption. Regrets? She asked, knowing the answer but enjoying the ritual of their banter. Not one, he replied, his voice dropping to a register meant only for her ears. Though I do sometimes wonder what might have happened if Whitewood had not returned from his continental tour when he did. Catherine considered this. I suspect you would have continued watching me from across ballrooms for at least another season, wrestling with your reserve while I grew increasingly frustrated. You're likely right, George acknowledged. I needed that push, the fear of losing you, to find my courage. As the music drew to a close, he kept hold of her hand, rather than escorting her from the floor. Walk with me in the garden. They slipped out through the terrace doors, the autumn night crisp but not uncomfortable. The formal gardens of Crestwick Manor spread before them, silver in the moonlight. George led her to a stone bench, nestled between carefully trimmed hedges, far enough from the house to ensure privacy. I received a letter from Whitewood's estate manager today, he said once they were seated. The experimental crop rotation we implemented last spring has increased yields by nearly 30%. If the results hold across our combined lands, we could present a compelling case to Parliament for agricultural reform. Catherine smiled at his enthusiasm. Where once the Duke had focused primarily on maintaining his family's legacy, marriage and fatherhood had expanded his vision to include a deep commitment to improving conditions throughout England, beginning with the land he stewarded. That's wonderful news, she said, though I suspect not the reason you brought me into the chilly night air. George's lips quirked in the half-smile that never failed to warm her heart. You know me too well, Duchess. He took both her hands in his. I wanted a moment alone with you, away from our guests and responsibilities. You have my full attention, she assured him, curious about his suddenly serious demeanor. 5 years ago, I nearly lost the most precious thing in my life through fear and hesitation, he began. I watched you from a distance, afraid to risk rejection, afraid that someone like you, so full of life and warmth, could never truly be happy with someone like me. George, she started, but he shook his head gently. Please, let me finish. I need to say this. He took a deep breath. That night at the Duchess's ball, when you smiled at Whitewood, something in me broke free. I realized then that some risks are worth taking, that some treasures are worth fighting for, even at the cost of one's pride. His dark eyes held hers intently. These past 5 years with you and our children have been the greatest blessing of my life. You have taught me that vulnerability is not weakness but strength, that a heart shared grows fuller rather than diminished. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. This belonged to my grandmother, he said, opening it to reveal an exquisite emerald ring surrounded by diamonds. I had intended to give it to you upon our engagement, but my courage failed me then. I feared it might seem presumptuous, given how recently you had accepted my suit. Catherine's eyes widened as he slipped the ring onto her right hand, where it caught the moonlight in flashes of green fire. Consider it a token of my continued courtship, he said softly. For I find that even after 5 years of marriage, I am still falling in love with you, Catherine. Still discovering new reasons to thank Providence for bringing you into my life, for giving me the opportunity to be not just a duke, but a husband and father, the roles I have come to cherish above all others. Tears pricked at Catherine's eyes, the simple sincerity of his words touching her deeply. You have come a long way from the man who could only watch me from across a ballroom, she said, her voice husky with emotion. Thanks to you, he acknowledged. You demanded more of me than anyone ever had. You saw potential where I saw only duty. Catherine leaned forward to kiss him tenderly. I love you, George Duff. The Duke, the husband, the father of my children, all of you, just as you are. They remained in the garden a while longer, talking quietly of their children, their hopes, the future they continued to build together. When they finally returned to the ballroom, several knowing glances were exchanged among the guests at the Duchess's slightly mussed hair and the Duke's unusually relaxed demeanor. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their private chambers, George watched Catherine remove the emerald ring and place it carefully in her jewelry box. It suits you, he observed, the green against your hair. She smiled at him through the mirror. It's beautiful, George. Thank you. He moved behind her, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. I have been thinking, he said, meeting her eyes in the reflection. "About expanding the nursery." Catherine turned to face him directly. "Have you indeed? And what prompted this architectural consideration, Your Grace?" A slow smile spread across his features. "Perhaps the fact that our daughter has been asking for a sister with increasing frequency, or perhaps simply the thought that our family might not yet be complete." She raised an eyebrow. "The doctor did say we should wait until the twins are at least 3 before considering another child." "The twins turned 3 last month," George pointed out. Catherine laughed softly, rising to wind her arms around his neck. "So they did. Very well, Duke. I believe the nursery expansion can be added to our spring renovations." 9 months later, the Duke and Duchess of Crestwick welcomed their 4th child, another daughter with her father's determined chin and her mother's bright eyes. As George held his newborn daughter while Catherine rested, he marveled at how completely his life had been transformed since that fateful night when he had finally found the courage to cross a ballroom floor. Once he had been known throughout London as the most reserved of dukes, a man who observed life rather than fully participating in it. Now, thanks to a smile given to a rival and the woman who had demanded more than his title and position, he had become something else entirely. A man who had learned that the greatest power comes not from control, but from the courage to open one's heart fully to love. And in the nursery at Crestwick Manor, where laughter rang through previously silent halls and tiny hands reached fearlessly for his, the Duke had found the greatest title of all, beloved. Dear listener, maybe you've stood in a quiet room holding your breath for someone to finally cross the distance toward you, like the Duke did. Maybe you've given your warmest smile to someone who didn't know how to receive it. Or maybe you were once the one who waited too long. This story is not just about ballrooms and titles. It's about the invisible courage it takes to open your heart again. Not just once, but again and again, even when life has knocked the wind from you. It's about how dignity and desire can live in the same soul, and how even after many seasons have passed, love can still arrive, not rushed, but real. You, dear heart, are not forgotten. Your wisdom, your laughter lines, your silent strength, they are chapters in a story that still matters. Tonight may you rest knowing that your presence is still a light in the world, that somewhere, someone is better because you exist, that peace belongs to you, not as a reward, but as a right. Close your eyes tonight with no weight on your chest. Let your past be wrapped in forgiveness, your present in softness, your future in quiet hope. You are safe. You are held. You are still becoming. With all our gratitude. Legends of the Fall Team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. We hope this story brought you comfort, inspiration, and maybe even a tear or two. If it touched your heart, we kindly invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share. It means the world to us and gives us the strength to keep telling more stories full of love, redemption, and emotional twists. From our hearts to yours, thank you. And don't forget, another beautiful story is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click it and be surprised. With love, the Legends of the Fall Team.